an integral part of at least 53 million Americans' lives is something that needs to be normalized. When we talk about care, I go back to that stigma, the idea of stigma. So many people are ashamed of their role as caregivers, particularly if it's removed them from the workplace and they've no longer been able to provide for their families monetarily because they're providing care. Caregiving is not something that, at least in this country, is valued. And it's not something that we applaud in the way that perhaps other countries might.
Did you know that in 2020, there were 53 million caregivers in the United States? And by 2025, this number is expected to grow to 62.5 million. 73% of these caregivers also have a job. They are called working caregivers, and they are invisible because they don't talk about their caregiving challenges. Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees, is a podcast that will show you how to support working caregivers. Join Selma Archer and Zach Demopoulos on the Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast as they show you how to support working caregivers.
Hello, everyone. I'm Selma Archer. Welcome to our podcast, Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees. I'm here with my co-host, Zach Demopoulos. Hi, Zach.
Hey, Selma. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Very excited about another amazing guest we're going to have today.
Absolutely. We're so excited to have Aisha Adkins with us today. Aisha does some amazing work in the care space. Hi, Aisha.
Hello. It's wonderful to see both of you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So before we get into the work that you do, we always ask our guests to tell us something interesting or unique about where they live. And you live in Atlanta.
I do. I live in Atlanta, home of the civil rights movement, some amazing and inspirational change makers who have legacies that are lasting to present day. I've had the privilege of meeting a number of folks, including Dr. Martin Luther King III. I actually met him while at a play with my father. It was a happenstance, but when you have the opportunity to meet folks, you take advantage, and particularly folks who are giants in the civil rights movement that we seem to be losing day by day. So it's a pleasure to have gotten to know him and to have met Congressman John Lewis and others.
Wow. So if we can, we'll move forward and talk a little bit about your work and what you do. And Zach and I have just been so thankful for your support in helping us with our project, which was our book. Thank you so much for that. We noticed that you are very visible in this space. You're out there doing speeches and podcast interviews, just really very prominent in this space. So can you share with the audience, how did you land in this work and what motivates you to stay there?
Certainly. So what landed me in this work is really my lived experience and my desire to share that with people. We're almost coming up on 8 years ago now, I started a blog, and it was primarily to inform family and friends of my family's adventures in the Caribbean island of Barbados, where we relocated temporarily. I wanted them to know what my experience providing care for my mother would be like on the island. And a woman named Amanda Beats found my blog, and she was really interested in learning more about what the transfer of care was like and some of the challenges that we experienced, but also some of the successes. And she was starting her own publication called The Black Expat, where she would talk about migration from one place to another among the Black community. And part of that, she wanted to include caregiving, because she was a caregiver herself. And so it started really with sharing my experience with her audience. And while working for her, I attended a conference called Blog Her, and it's targeted toward women in digital media. I looked at the schedule for the conference, and there was a breakout discussion on caregiving. I thought that was most fascinating the strangest thing to have at a conference like this. And I knew, okay, I have to attend this breakout session. So I joined the breakout session and learned more from the panel, just comprised of a number of women from different backgrounds who had created online communities to support family caregivers. And so many of them had stories similar to my own. And that's what really encouraged me to continue moving forward. I found out toward the end of that session that it was sponsored by Caring Across Generations. I was really excited to be introduced to the organization that I had never heard of before. Eventually, over the next few months, I would learn more about the organization. I would become engaged with them and begin volunteering.
Okay. Very interesting.
That's incredible, Aisha. Thank you for sharing that. In addition to the gratitude that Selma was expressing to you on our behalf for the book work, I want to also personally express my gratitude to you. When I began my research on becoming a caregiver advocate, you were one of the first caregiver advocates that I met, that you were so kind to get on a Zoom call with me, and you and I spent some time together, and you really educated me and inspired me from all the caregiving experiences that you have. And we've come a long way since then, both of us, all three of us actually. And I just want to thank you that you're one of the first that I met and spoke to. Just two strangers getting on the call, if you remember that. And it was,
I do.
It was pretty amazing. So I want to thank you for that. You mentioned Caring Across Generations, and I'd like you to please share a little bit more with our listeners what that's about, because, Selma and I really, when we wrote our book, we talked about resources and how important it is. And, something like Caring Across Generations, I can probably assure you most of our listeners have never heard of. As much as you guys market and you're present and visible, please share more about that. And what specifically do you do for them, and what do they do for us?
So Caring Across Generations is a policy advocacy organization focused on bringing together family caregivers, disabled people, and older adults to advocate for better access to the resources that we all need in order to live and age in our homes and communities with the dignity that we all deserve. So what that looks like for my role as training manager is I lead cohorts alongside my colleague of care fellows who are people who fall into the categories that I just named and who are interested in using their lived experience as either caregivers or care recipients to transform the way that care is given, received, and viewed in this country. Additionally, we work with a number of celebrities, but also a number of businesses as a part of both our creative care council and our business council. And we engage with them on issues regarding care policy, how to advocate not only in the halls of government, but in the workplace as well, and really transforming what it means to be a working caregiver.
You're talking to our audience. You said if somebody wants to get involved in that, what's the best way for them to get involved?
Certainly the best way to get involved is by reaching out to us via our website, caringacross.org.
I was just wondering, listening to you talk about relocating to Barbados for did you say 8 years?
Oh, for just a few months.
Oh, okay. While you were there, did you notice any differences, or could you talk a little bit about any differences in terms of availability of resources as well as access to resources comparatively, in the U.S. versus outside the U.S.?
Well, it's very interesting because, firstly, the most noticeable difference, I would say, in accessing care in Barbados is their lack of policies like HIPAA and other kind of compliance policies that made it very difficult to transfer records from the United States. That was certainly a challenge, one that we were able to circumvent by talking with our providers. But it was certainly something that was interesting, and that my father's workplace at the time wasn't quite prepared to help us navigate. And I think it's something that should come with every onboarding package right? I think it's something that everyone can benefit from, not just those who are giving or receiving care. There are still stigma across not only the Caribbean and the United States, but really around the world around diseases like dementia or other cognitive declines, cognitive impairments. And so navigating the spaces, there seem to be less support in some ways for someone who's living with the disease, fewer support groups, fewer opportunities to advocate. I guess I shouldn't say fewer opportunities to advocate because, where there are no opportunities, that's where your opportunity lies, right? But I would say that it was just interesting kind of entering into the unknown and having to find resources that matched my mother's care needs and really explore what that looked like in a country that we had never lived in before.
Yes. So there's work to be done around the globe. So I wondered, we go back for a minute to the interview that you shared with us in our book. You made the suggestion that people should start to include their caregiving work on their resume when they're out looking for, employment. And we noticed that you have your care experience on your LinkedIn profile. So can you talk a little bit about how important you feel that is to include that work in your experiences?
Of course. I believe that caregiving as an integral part of at least 53 million Americans' lives is something that needs to be normalized. When we talk about care, it should not, again, I go back to that stigma, the idea of stigma. So many people are ashamed of their role as caregivers, particularly if it's removed them from the workplace and they've no longer been able to provide for their families monetarily because they're providing care. Caregiving is not something that, at least in this country, is valued. And it's not something that we applaud in the way that perhaps other countries might, or I would say, more importantly, sickness and aging are so stigmatized that anything associated with those things tends to also garner stigma. And by placing the fact that you are a caregiver on your resume or on your LinkedIn, I think that it normalizes it. It allows others to say, oh, well, I've had that same experience. Additionally, there are skills that you acquire, particularly, I think of myself as a younger caregiver. I was in my late 20s when I began caring for my mother and left my first job in healthcare to provide care for her. And immediately I was concerned about what that gap in my resume would do, what impact it might have on my career. But what I learned was, how to navigate the healthcare system. I learned how to navigate Medicare and Medicaid. I understood, government agencies. I became the household manager, financial manager, financial planning. All of those things came into play in a way that would not have been the case had I not been a caregiver. And I think so many of those skills are transferable. I made good use of spreadsheets and learned how to use some of those function options. And, those are skills that employers do look for. There's a lot of communication that takes place, document creation and documentation. So I think that it may take a bit of creativity, but it's certainly important that we are sure to appreciate these skills that family caregivers earn and learn over time in these roles, and understand the ways in which they're transferable to other roles and the value that life experience brings to the workplace. So I would say, don't be ashamed. It's not only an admirable thing to do, but those are skills that many employers look for.
We know for sure, as as caregivers, we have to be just genius at multitasking. You have to be able to handle so many balls in the air at once and stay on top of all the things that are going on and the things that you don't expect to happen from day to day, moment to moment. So I think probably there, some work that we could do with the employers to help them perceive the importance of this work. So that's probably a good place to take a look, as well from what you're saying.
And so glad you're advocating that, Aisha, because there's the academic advocators and then there's those who've done it, advocators, and you've done it. And I love on your LinkedIn, and I encourage everybody to look up Aisha Adkins on LinkedIn, but I love that your tagline is caregiver organizer. And you just described why you put organizer up there. You are probably the best when it comes to that. Multitasking. I'm so glad you brought up stigma and stereotypes. I think we're doing a good job nationally to help change that. At least that's one of the reasons why Selma and I wrote our book, especially. But there's still that notion that the typical caregiver is someone in their middle ages, usually a woman, married to somebody or a partner with somebody, and they can just take off work and care for somebody. But yet you, 27 years old, in the middle of undergraduate studies, I believe, or graduate studies, and you left your job and helped start caring for your mother, 10 is becoming more and more typical. And so what I'd like to ask you, this is a two-part question, because our listeners are both working caregivers as well as leaders and managers and HR folks, and we all need to hear your answer to this. What's one or two things that you would like our listeners to walk away with based on the fact that you are a young caregiver unexpectedly jumping into this role? What could you leave with them as far as either getting ready for it or how to handle it once they're in the thick of it?
Those are excellent questions, Zach. And I would say there are two things to take into consideration. In terms of supporting current family caregivers in the workplace, making work accessible is going to be key. Making sure that, if there are opportunities for hybrid workplaces or remote work options, that we lean into that. Studies have shown that many people are, more productive from home because they're not at work kind of trying to sneakily perform caregiving duties, and they're not worried and concerned about how their person is doing. When there are opportunities for accessibility in that way, amplifying those and uplifting those and making them available, I think is key. I think for those who are in positions to hire people who may have seemingly unexplained gaps in their resumes, or gaps in their resumes that to you at first glance may not seem applicable to the roles for which they're being hired, I would recommend that we kind of broaden our scope in terms of our understanding around what is applicable directly to the roles that we're seeking to fulfill as employers. I think that consideration and taking a chance on folks, you might be pleasantly surprised that folks are qualified or even overqualified in some ways to do an excellent job, and taking that opportunity to give them the chance to re-enter or maybe enter for the first time a field that they're passionate about is something that can reward not only the working caregiver, but the company and the industry overall.
Those are two great suggestions. And, I'm glad you brought those two up, because a lot of employers kind of push back sometimes and think, what's this going to cost us? Can we afford it? And there was no cost in with the examples you just gave, at the end of the day. In fact, organizations can't afford not to do these things. Just one more question, because Selma and I tried in our book to do some education. And education also is important in ways that you can support your working caregivers. In one of your most recent podcast interviews, you mentioned that your mother was at home hospice, and everybody's kind of afraid of the H word, hospice, and we talk about it in the book. Can you share a little bit more about that so that people listening can be less afraid of it and more aware of it and to tap into it? Again, that doesn't cost the employer a dime. It will reward the employer if you could share some of this information with your employees and make it look like you're being empathetic, right? Or compassionate. Can you share a little bit about with our listeners what that's all about?
Like many of your listeners, I'm sure, for most of my life, I always considered hospice a place you go to, right? Never a place that comes to you. And through my experience at Caring Across Generations and the conversations that I've had with other family caregivers there, and also in other work that I've done, I discovered that hospice is something that can take place in the home and that can be incredibly supportive. And it's something that I know my mother's end of life experience was greatly improved because of access to hospice care in the home. And it included not only nurse care, but also supplies that are sometimes needed at the end of life and chaplain services. And so there really is a wraparound experience. And I think having access to that from an employee standpoint, again, it makes the experience less stressful, makes the employee feel more supported and more likely to excel in their work if they know that there is care that's being provided in the home. From an employer standpoint, that as much as possible, you are implementing policies and making resources available to your employees that allow them to focus on the important things in life. I think that, when we're not splitting our focus, splitting our attention, and we're able to really buckle down and dedicate the time to, caring for our loved one and then, focusing on those tasks we have in the workplace, I think it's something that, again, benefits everyone. It's a win-win-win situation. No one really loses with that experience. And certainly for the person receiving care who is priority, it improves their quality of end of life. And I think there's nothing more important than that.
I love the way you put that. Win-win-win, right? So yes, the employer wins. Yes, the employee wins. But most importantly, the care recipient wins. And that's a great share. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you.
Thank you. So looks like we've come to the end of our time here. Before we leave, though, Aisha, could you just share with our listeners where they could find you if they want to know more about your absolutely fabulous work in the space and what you do and learn more about your actual journey in this space, which is amazing. I think everybody should. It's so inspiring. I really think everybody that's listening should tap into that. You will be encouraged by what you've gone through. But if you could share with the audience how they can find you.
Certainly. I would say the easiest way to get in touch and to learn more is by visiting AishaAdkins.com. That's Adkins with a D. I know some folks spell it with a T. But that will lead you to, more information about my journey and my work and my social media as well.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. We were honored by your presence and just so much richness that you had to share about your work. And thank you so much for that.
Thank you both for the opportunity. It's been wonderful to talk with you and to collaborate in this way, in addition to the pub.
Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to catch new episodes of Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast, every other Tuesday. Please also visit our website, invisibleemployeeadvocates.com, to subscribe to our newsletter, purchase our book, and learn more about how we can help you strengthen your workplace to become more supportive of working caregivers.